My name is Joseph Mbele, and I'm a professor at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. I've been here since 1991 in the English department. I teach literatures from around the world, as well as folklore. I was born and raised in southern Tanzania before the country became independent. And at that time, it was called Tanganyika. It's a lovely country on the eastern side of Africa. I was born in a rural place, so I'm a farm kid. I grew up helping my parents grow coffee, beans, corn, raising cattle, sheep, goats, chickens. That's my background. But I was lucky. The country distinguished itself from the very beginning as an independent country. It distinguished itself as a supporter of liberation movements. We got independence in 1961. We were called Tanganyika at that time. And there was an island which was a separate country next to the mainland, next to Tanganyika. That island was called Zanzibar. So 1964, the two countries formed a union, and that's how we got the name Tanzania, 1964. Before then, there was Tanganyika, the mainland part, and then Zanzibar, the island. We distinguished ourselves as supporters of liberation movements, and so the entire cultural, educational, political system was geared towards cultivating solidarity with other people around the world who were fighting for independence. That included people from all over Africa and also people from outside of Africa. For example, in the Americas, we supported the movement for civil rights. We welcomed members of the Black Panther Party, for example, who escaped from the USA. They got refuge in my country. And we used to listen to them. We used to read about their experiences. So for me, the education I got there was quite rich in terms of internationalism. It was not just focused on my country, but it was focused on learning about other countries and the struggles going on around the world. So I'm proud of that heritage, and I'll talk about the leader, our first leader, in a few minutes, because I'll be talking about Pan-Africanism as well. The culture in Tanzania is very diverse. We have many ethnic groups, 127. These are groups that speak different languages. They are different cultures, essentially. 127 different languages and different races. That's important to also underline. The majority are, Black Africans, but we have also a lot of people of Oriental origin, Middle Eastern origin, people from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, places like that. And we have Europeans as well who settled in our country. Not too many, but they are there. So we are a multiracial country. And we just identify as one country, as one people, one nation. How did I become a scholar? How did I become a teacher? It's a very interesting story. Growing up as the firstborn child of farmers in the rural place, and my parents were not teachers or anything. I just wanted to be a teacher. I was so inspired. I don't know why, I don't know how. I just felt I needed to be a teacher. And that has never changed in my entire life. And every day I walk into the classroom, I feel, it's like a dream coming true. And I tell my students that teaching for me was not a job, it's actually a vocation. So I see teaching as a multi-dimensional activity. And so part of it has to do with writing. Part of it has to do with writing. So I do a lot of writing, and I'll talk about this. I write about many things, but especially culture, the oral traditions of storytelling in our country, in our continent. I write about literature, analysis of works of literature, study guides. I write those. But I also write about culture, especially in terms of African culture as compared to American culture. I do a lot of speaking as well, talking to people about the cultural differences, talking to Americans about African culture, and talking to Africans about American culture and the differences in order to prepare them for any kind of relationship they might have. There are Americans who go to Africa as students, as volunteers, as tourists. There are many Africans who come to the USA, who have come to the USA, students, workers, those kinds of things. Some have come as immigrants, some have come as refugees, but they do need to understand the cultural differences, and so I write about those as well. I see writing as an extension of teaching. It is an extension of teaching. I teach in the classroom, but I also teach in my writings or through my writings. That book I write, that article I write, continues the activity that I do in the classroom. I really don't separate writing from teaching. Writing is an extension of my teaching. So I'm very comfortable being a writer. It's not easy always, and I'll talk about this, but I think it's inseparable from from teaching. And as a teacher, I know I have to speak a lot, speak with people all the time, tell them what I know, tell them what I think, try to answer their questions. I can never be a reserved person. I'm always out there talking with people, saying what I have on my mind. And so writing, as I say, is an extension of that. I therefore like to talk about my writings also. Just like I tell people what I know about folklore, what I know about literature, everywhere, I like to talk about my books. Yes, I don't have any hesitation to tell people about my books. Just like I don't have any hesitation answering their questions or just telling them what I know as a result of my reading, my research, and so on. It's a difficult topic to address because there was a time when I was very reluctant to talk about my books. But I reached a point where I said, why am I that way? My books are an extension of who I am. And I never hesitate to tell people who I am, what I know, and so on and so on. As I say, I write different kinds of books. I record folk tales in my culture. Yes. And I translate them into English. I've published a book of these folk tales from my culture. That's one kind of writing. Not my own creativity in the strict sense of the word, but recording stories that were, told by our ancestors, and we heard them from the ancestors, and then translating them and making them available in in English, so that the whole world can hear their voices, the voices of our ancestors. They can experience life the way they experienced it. They can learn what they thought about life and relationships and values and human behavior and the human condition. So I'm amplifying their voice. That's one kind of writing. When I interpret literature, a novel, a poem, or whatever it is, that's when I speak for myself. So that's a different kind of writing. It's me thinking and creating those ideas, making, judgments and observations. That's my personal statement. That's another kind of writing. And it's the same when I write about the cultural differences, American culture, African culture. That's really me making observations, me interpreting what I see. So there's that kind of writing as well. And I'll talk about writing a little bit more later. I've been asked to talk about Pan-Africanism, a very interesting subject. It's a very interesting subject. Pan-Africanism is an ideology. It is an ideology. It's a political movement. It's a cultural movement. It has all these dimensions, and we could spend a lot of time talking about them. But also, it manifests itself differently in different historical periods and in different parts of the world. It's not just within Africa itself, but it's also in the Americas, all the way from Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, the United States. And it embraces Black people across the world, and that includes Europe and Asian countries. There are a lot of Black people in the Middle East, Iraq, for example, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran. So, and they are in Turkey, they are in Russia, there are all kinds of places, other parts of Europe, England, and so on, Germany, France. So when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we are talking about a reality that recognizes the existence of Black people across the world and historically. As an ideology, it started as a movement to keep alive the awareness of belonging to a place, that all Black people came from Africa, and that brings them together. They have something in common. That's already the beginning of Pan-Africanist consciousness. And it continues to be emphasized, the fact of African origins in different writings. You read that. But it's also a movement. Pan-Africanism is a movement. When Black people were taken from Africa to the Americas, and we know how that started, when those Black people came here, they harbored the desire, actually, to go back to Africa. They couldn't physically go back, but the desire was there. And then, after emancipation in this country, in the United States, after the end of the slave trade, as people put it, you have people standing and advocating that black people need to move out of the Americas and go back to Africa. And I'm thinking of the most important one at the beginning, Marcus Garvey. He organized this movement of getting people out of the Americas back to Africa. And that movement, there's a big history, connected with it. And Marcus Garvey was a remarkable dreamer. He was charismatic. He charmed people with his ideas about the need for black people to have their own country. He was very charismatic. He was a great dreamer. But he had also great weaknesses. And people who study his life, will talk about that. But he's quite admirable. He tried his best to inculcate a sense of pride in being black, and also the idea of, just moving back to the homeland to create a separate homeland. There have been many people of African descent who have kept that idea and who have actually migrated to Africa. We know there were many who went to Liberia from the United States. Even now, as we are talking, the year 2023, we have a lot of African Americans who are moving to Africa. And so we can see this as a continuation of that same Pan-Africanist idea as a movement, rather, that same concept of Pan-Africanism as a movement. There are black people going to places like Gambia and Senegal and Ghana and Rwanda, Tanzania, my country, and South Africa. So that movement continues. As I've said, Pan-Africanism manifests itself differently, historically, and so on. After Marcus Garvey, there came a whole bunch of leaders, Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, out here in the Americas, Du Bois, and on the continent itself, we have people like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Sekou Toure of Guinea, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. So many people are connected with the movement. And in Africa itself, the main agenda of Pan-Africanism was to fight for independence against colonialism. That was the top priority. That was the agenda on the continent. So from 1945, when there was the Pan-Africanist movement in Manchester, 1945, attended by people like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Peter Abrahams of South Africa, and so many other people, the struggle for independence, the building of nationalist movements within Africa itself to fight for independence. And Pan-Africanism was actually a movement directed towards helping one another to achieve independence. And again, as I say, there are many figures over there. In the Caribbean, there was the same thing of independence, but there was also issues of racism. And again, because the people in the Caribbean were far away from Africa, there was also the idea of going back to Africa. So that dimension of, the return to Africa as part of Pan-Africanism was something you saw out here in the Americas. And in the United States, the big issue was, of course, racism. And so you have the Pan-Africanists of Africa supporting the black people in the USA in their struggle for racial equality, for civil rights, and so on. And so, but again, the people here in the USA, they also connected with the people in Africa. There was a sense of supporting one another. You support the struggles in Africa for independence. They support the struggle here for civil rights and against racism and things like that. So it's important to understand the complexity of the movement. There was also a cultural dimension to Pan-Africanism. Cultural dimension. Pan-Africanism manifested itself in cultural movements, literary movements, like negritude. There is something called negritude, and it's a big story. From around 1930, black people, black students studying in France, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Madagascar, other parts of Africa, they are in France, and they recognize the need to speak with one voice. They need to discover their common heritage, especially because they are now facing in France a racist system. And they feel they're being pushed to adopt and identify with European culture. So they begin to raise questions about whether this is really necessary. And so the idea of discovering their own blackness and the black heritage, going back into the past to recover the stories, the songs, the art, the ideas of what it is to be human in the world. So they formed the movement called Negritude. It was mostly, expressed in poetry, mostly poetry. People like Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, Aimé Césaire of Martinique, different forms of art, music, and so on. So there was that cultural dimension, negritude, embracing people from the Americas, especially the Caribbean and Africa. There were movements like the Harlem Renaissance here in the USA, the Harlem Renaissance. Yes, in the 20s, a little before the 20s, but in the 20s, 30s, we know this. Poets, musicians, and artists, and playwrights of different kinds, writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, poets like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, folklorists like Zora Neale Hurston. And the Harlem Renaissance was an attempt, again, for people in this country, black people in this country, to rediscover the black heritage, to utilize it in their own creative works, whether it was drama, music, poetry, whatever. And also, the Harlem Renaissance recognized the need to link up with the movements in Africa. The dream of Africa as the homeland is there in the Harlem Renaissance. So again, it's important to see the Harlem Renaissance as another manifestation of the Pan-Africanist thing that we are talking about. In the Caribbean itself, you have movements like Rastafarianism, starting again around 1930 in Jamaica, in the slums. And it's a movement which is cultural, religious, political, ideological, It has to do with the resisting colonialism, colonial culture, the need to recover and build on African roots to create something as an alternative to the colonial racist culture in the Caribbean. Advocating equality, emancipation of black people, not only in this part of the world, but also in Africa. And the Rastafarian movement sees Africa as a homeland and the Americas as a place of exile, as Babylon, they call it, Babylon. So I think it's important to see Rastafarianism as a manifestation, concrete expression of the Pan-Africanist ideal. It's very helpful in terms of understanding these things to look at cultural expressions as well, so that we don't get bogged down in academic theoretical conversations and just reading abstract books written by scholars. We could listen to music, like reggae music. You can hear the songs of Bob Marley or the songs of Peter Tosh, people like that. And Peter Tosh says, as long as you are a black man, you are an African. Whether you are from Trenchtown, whether from Chicago, whether from London, as long as you are a black man, you are an African. Those messages come out, in very pleasant ways in songs as well. And for me, as a folklorist, as a scholar of literature, I need to emphasize these things so that when we talk about Pan-Africanism, it becomes a very interesting, multi-dimensional subject. And you can dwell on the angle that pleases you. You can dwell on the angle that resonates with you. Some of the leaders of Pan-Africanism, I've mentioned Marcus Garvey, I've mentioned Julius Nyerere. Let me just talk about Nyerere. I've talked about Garvey, Marcus Garvey, a very charismatic leader who really mobilized people. He played a big role in restoring, the pride of the people in being who they are. He did that at a very difficult time, and I think he's a great figure, very great figure. He was absolutely remarkable. He had weaknesses, and they proved to be his undoing eventually. But we can talk about that. Julius Nyerere, as an example, he was my president, the first president of my country. He led us to independence. And right from the beginning, even before we became independent in 1961, he was in the forefront of Pan-Africanism, working in conjunction with other people, with other leaders, working in conjunction with other leaders to form the Organization of African Unity in Ethiopia. He was in the forefront supporting liberation movements. Our country became the base for liberation movements from across Africa, all the way, from South Africa to Central Africa to North Africa, and again, beyond Africa as well. He was a great Pan-Africanist, a great patriot, and he inspired people around the world with his theories about building a society on the basis of African foundations, traditional African values. He had the theory of Ujamaa, and I think I'll talk about this later because it comes up again in some ways when we talk about Kwanzaa. Another Pan-Africanist that I definitely, enjoy talking about would be, Walter Rodney, a historian from Guyana. And I happened to be at the University of Dar es Salaam. He happened to be there, and I was a student there. I came later as a student in 1973. A very charismatic, brilliant historian who restored to us as a young generation at the time, the sense of looking at Africa from an African point of view. People talk about Afrocentric perspectives, and Walter Rodney inspired us to interpret our own history on our own terms. He wrote a book that really galvanized our consciousness. It's called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And again, in his own life, he is a guy from the Caribbean, Guyana. He studied in London, and then he came to teach in our country, participating in the revolutionary struggles that were going on in Africa. And I could talk forever about him, Walter Rodney. I could talk about Malcolm X. We enjoyed reading the stories about Malcolm X. We enjoyed listening to his speeches when we were in high school, and he stands as a great example. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Kenneth Kaunda, Zambia, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya, and so on and so on. I could talk about all of those in their own ways. Kwanzaa. What does Kwanzaa mean to me? What is Kwanzaa? I got to know about it really after coming to the USA. I've heard the name when I was still in Tanzania. It's a movement, an idea started in 1966 by Maulana Ron Karenga. I know that, and coming to the USA, I had the opportunity to observe the Kwanzaa ceremonies, yes, to read about them. The name, the way it is spelled, is not the way it is spelled in Swahili. In Swahili, it's Kwanzaa, only one A at the end. And Karenga created a word that looked like the Swahili word. But the idea behind it was to celebrate a festival, a tradition that's very widespread in Africa and actually outside of Africa, among agricultural people when they do their harvest, the first harvest. Across Africa, they have this idea of a harvest festival, some ritual to commemorate the first fruits, the first crops. In some ways, you have these traditions in Nigeria, in Central African countries, East African countries. They are called by different names, given the different languages. And the observance is also different according to the different cultures. There's the Yam Festival in Nigeria, for example. I think it's among the Yorubas and the Igbos. So that provides the background. And I'm thinking now of African Americans being here far away from Africa, basically lost in a culture that was not their original culture, and dispersed in different parts of the country, and subjected to social, political pressures which really sought to make them forget, their origins and so on, to make them embrace, the white culture and all this. One can understand the reason for Maulana Karenga's desire to start something that would bring cohesion to the experience, to the dreams, to the sense of self of these African Americans who are actually in exile over here. So I definitely think it was a great idea, and he had to create it because it was not there. Unlike in Africa, where the traditions are there, thriving, the idea of creating something, was a good idea. I look at the principles of Kwanzaa, and everybody knows about them, I guess. Umoja, unity, yes. Kujichagulia, they say kujichagulia, nia, ujima, ujamaa, those kinds of things. Now, my sense is this, as a folklorist, as somebody who studies the African traditions, my sense is that while it's important and necessary to study the meanings of all these principles, it's very important not to see them as isolated entities. It's very important to see them as a system, as a unified system, and these are only dimensions of that system. Culture is a system. You don't pick one thing and, think of it in isolation from something else over there. That's the one thing I would say about the Kwanzaa. People should look at the whole system, and there are some other dimensions too that make the African heritage more complex than the principles of Kwanzaa. There are spiritual elements, there are just notions of, being a good neighbor and respect for the elders. The idea that you are a human being because you are connected with other human beings. The notion of Ubuntu. You are because we are. The individual is not an individual. The individual is part of the community. So your life is not your private concern only. It's very much a public, a communal concern. So you are expected to fulfill roles in the community. In traditional Africa, you are part of a clan, you are part of an ethnic group, you are part of a family. You don't talk about yourself as an individual. People want to know who is your father, who is your sister, who is your uncle, the relationships. So when we talk about Kwanzaa, I think we need to think of all those principles as part of a system, and the system is bigger than those principles. Those principles are there, but there are other principles as well. And it's just the way traditional African life worked. It's not something you theorize, it's the way you live. So sharing, your food, sharing whatever you have, sharing space, welcoming people, eating together. Things are very communal. You don't eat alone, you eat with other people. And people offer food, you cannot say no. You cannot say no. Refusing food is antisocial. And eating with other people affirms the goodness of your spirit. It's a ritual. So beyond Kwanzaa, we need to look at the entire fabric of society, the ideology that shapes it, that sustains it. But Kwanzaa is a very good beginning. It's more or less theoretical because people in this country, in the USA, still live a very capitalistic life. It's very individualistic. Even the very notion of kujichagulia that appears in Kwanzaa, kujichagulia, it's a good principle as long as it doesn't mean, being an individual and making choices that suit you, for your own interest. Because kujichagulia comes from the word kuchagua, to choose for yourself, yes. But it shouldn't mean that individualistic right to make your own choices. That would be against the African principle. Kujichagulia would be relevant, and we need to see it as relevant only if we think of the community. The community making its own decisions, the country making its own decisions. And in this way, like Africans making their own decisions. We have a common destiny. We have to choose for ourselves, to resist impositions that we have experienced historically. So kujichagulia should have that kind of collective meaning for the people of African descent to define the world, their own way, to take, their destiny in their own hands, just as they did when they fought for independence, and today when they are fighting to bring about unity and to resist neocolonialism. Kwanzaa and also Pan-Africanism, they focus very much on black people and the black lives. And I think there has to come a time where we think about the need to connect with fellow human beings. This world has black people, Oriental people, Europeans, and so on and so on. We share this world. We cannot keep thinking only of, blackness and the black race. We have to define a place. We have to define a way of connecting and connecting with other races. The human race. Yes, there is an agenda. There is a need for black people to come together, define themselves, recapture and build their culture. But there's also the issue of connecting with other human beings. And so when I talked about negritude, I mentioned the poet from Martinique, Aimé Césaire. He was a nationalist, cultural nationalist, like other people. He was all for negritude as a black ideology, but he also, in his poem, Return to My Native Land, he somehow redefines negritude as a system that embraces all human beings. I think we need to teach ourselves, to remind ourselves to also think broadly. And there we will touch base with the ideas, the dream of Martin Luther King Jr., who was great advocate for black cause, for the black cause. He was a great advocate for emancipation of black people, civil rights and all this. But he also expressed the idea that he wanted to see a world. He was dreaming of a world where, people will be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. I think that's a very important message, and I'm saying the struggle for black identity, black emancipation, Pan-Africanism is very important, but we also need to go beyond. At some point, we will be ready, I believe, to go and achieve the dream that Martin Luther King had. I've mentioned Marcus Garvey. I've mentioned Aimé Césaire. His ideology was left-wing, socialistic. And so he saw beyond the color of the skin. He saw beyond race. And he talked about class as well. And that's very important. People of a particular class, say the working class, they have common interests, whether they are black, white, yellow. There is that level also that they need to consider to form solidarity on the basis of class interests. It's not enough to talk about, being black. It's very important to also find ways to connect with people who are also victims of the same system that brought about the slave trade, the system that brought about colonialism, the system that continues to enslave workers today. It's a capitalist system. But again, that's a topic for another day. I'm just trying to say Pan-Africanism, negritude, the principles of Kwanzaa, they are very essential. But beyond it, we'll need to open the doors to form solidarities across races. And that's the kind of thing Martin Luther King Jr. had in mind. Again, this is a big topic. We can talk a lot about it. There is also the question of writing in terms of my own writing. I really cannot talk about it much because I don't have any principles. For me, writing comes naturally in the sense that I like to teach, I like to do research. There are topics, there are fields which I'm deeply, deeply interested in. Culture, folklore, recording, studying, translating, interpreting folk tales. I'm excited about these things. So naturally, I write because I'm excited by the topics. The issue of differences between American and African culture excites me. I have studied these differences for many years, and I'm excited about helping Africans understand Americans and helping Americans understand Africans. I'm deeply excited by this, and so naturally I like to write about these things. All the time I'm writing, and I've books published. I will never stop. It comes from within. So for me, it's not a matter of rules, and this is what I do. First I do this. It comes spontaneously. I do a draft. I put it aside. I'm excited about what I'm doing. I work on it again. I bring another dimension. I read a lot. What other people have written. I incorporate it in my own writing. I speak to various audiences. I get invited to speak, and I answer questions. I learn to clarify my concepts because I'm speaking to different audiences, and all these experiences shape my writing. There are no rules. It's just the spirit driving me into all these things, including writing. It's quite disorganized, or rather unorganized, and it's great because I enjoy it. So if I'm to give advice to anybody about writing, I would say identify the thing you really like. You will find yourself wanting to say something about it. I remember when we were taught writing in middle school, the teacher would come in and they would ask us to write an essay on a random topic. Very boring. It's a topic that has, no relationship to my life. I'm not interested in it, and I have to write an essay on it. It's a nightmare. So what I do, because I teach a course at St. Olaf College that everybody in the English department teaches, it's called writing, first year writing. I decided as a folklorist, one way to get people interested in writing, to get my students interested, is to make them read stories, trickster stories. They are very exciting, they are very inspiring, they are very funny, they are very engaging, they are irresistible. You read that story, folk tale, you absolutely will want to say something. You want to say something because it strikes you, it excites you. So if I were to teach a class on writing, or to advise people on writing, And given the fact that we are talking about the African heritage, we're talking about Pan-Africanism and Kwanzaa and those things, I would suggest something that's meaningful in all these ways. I will say, read African folk tales. Yes, pick up African folk tales. Those folk tales embody and express the entire spirit of Kwanzaa, all those values. You read the folk tales, you read the proverbs, African proverbs. There are thousands of them. Take some African proverb, you will find a theme, you'll find an idea to write about. And in the process, you will learn more about Kwanzaa principles in practice, how people in those tales, how the characters in those tales live their lives, how they interact, the things they do which are defined in the traditions as wrong, or the things they do which are defined as desirable or right. Read African folk tales, I would say. Study African proverbs. It will serve the purpose of understanding the principles of Kwanzaa very much. There is a principle that people are using these days. It's an old principle, old African principle, Ubuntu, that recognizes a human being as connected with other human beings, and therefore it raises the idea that you need to really connect with fellow human beings. That's Ubuntu. You respect each other, you support each other, you recognize, each other as a fellow human being. And so generosity, sharing what you have, is built into that. And there are proverbs which carry these notions. So, tips for writing for me would be read African folk tales, study the proverbs. You will be inspired to write in ways that connect with our topics for today. In closing, I will say writing has been a very rewarding thing for me. It's very challenging. You do a draft, you revise it, and I like to revise and revise and revise. I have learned something from the great writer Ernest Hemingway, who used to revise his writings endless times. He would revise a paragraph or the ending of a novel countless times. And learning to express myself in simple sentences, short sentences, maybe not simple but short, and learning to be precise, economical in my writing, and just trying to do the best I can with language. There's so much satisfaction, there's a sense of fulfillment when I've reached a point where I say, I can let this thing go to the public. And for all of us, as African people, we have a duty to write our own stories, to express our perspective, because we have had other people, the colonizers, the slave masters, writing about us and misrepresenting us. We must reclaim our voices. We must, make ourselves heard. As I've also said, I like writing in terms of preserving our cultural heritage. I record our tales so they don't get lost, traditional tales. I'm happy I've published a book. I've written about those folk tales to help the world to understand the legacy, the heritage that our ancestors created and left to us. So it's not just a matter of just celebrating the heritage. It's first and foremost studying it, recording it, studying it, interpreting it, and then, of course, celebrating it. So those are the few words I have to say for today, and I've enjoyed this opportunity very much, and I hope we will have opportunities to keep talking about these important questions. It has been a pleasure talking to you all. I hope I've raised some significant issues, some issues you can think about, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.